Spirits are a special type of effect monster, which all generally share the effect of returning to the hand during the end phase when they're normal summon or flip face up, and with the restriction of not being able to be special summoned. Out of all the mechanics that never amounted to anything in Yu-Gi-Oh!, spirits have not only not received much cohesive support to the mechanic, but they're also one of the ones that have aged the worst. The main idea behind spirit monsters was to have monsters with really powerful effects when they hit the field. They also have the added benefit of being reusable on your next turn by returning to your hand during the end phase, while also not being able to be destroyed by battle or spell speed 1 removal effects. The balancing mechanism was that since they cannot be special summoned, spirits would always be taking up your normal summon for the turn, putting you behind on tempo and field presence by using them. This is essentially what killed any longevity the mechanic had, as the game became more and more special summon focused with time, even back in the day. It didn't help that this mechanic had the same issues that Gemini's did, in that many of their monsters wouldn't see play even if they had no restrictions whatsoever attached to them. Even the concept of reusable normal summons, which was valuable back in the day, would also get overshadowed by better monsters which could grab you follow-up for the next turn without all the downsides of spirits. If even back in the day these monsters were already falling out of favor, we can see there is a very good reason there's only been a single spirit monster to see play in the last several years. Still, despite being home to so many unimpressive cards throughout the years, let's go through how competitively relevant spirit monsters were in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. First, we have Yatagarasu. This is a level 2 Wind Fiend with only 200 attack. It has the usual spirit monster stipulations, in that it cannot be specialed and returns to the hand during the end phase of the turn it was normaled or flip face up, and the effect to skip your opponent's next draw phase if it inflicts battle damage. This was one of the couple spirit monsters to have ever put on the ban list, and the only one to still be there in some way as the time of recording this video, though that has more to do with Konami being slow to updating the ban list than anything else. Yata saw play as the ultimate win more card in extremely old Yu-Gi-Oh! Formats. With the games being extremely swingy due to all those powerful spells still being legal, you could leverage a momentary advantage into a game-ending play if the opponent couldn't answer Yata denying them their outs turn after turn. However, this card only became really good when coupled together with Sangan and Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy of the End. In short, the combo would use Chaos Emperor Dragon's field and hand wipe to send away all your opponent's cards and your Sangan, so that you could search Yata from your deck and use your normal summon to lock your opponent entirely out of the game. Despite being clearly the least powerful card of the three, Yata was the one to remain on the ban list the longest. Though, to be fair, that's because both Sangan and Chaos Emperor Dragon ended up getting erratas at some point. This card was one of the few spirit monsters which actually earned all the restrictions spirit monsters have by default. It was never overly powerful by itself, and only saw play due to the brokenness of other cards surrounding it at the time, being just a finisher. Unfortunately for Yata though, it used a mechanic which Konami would deem unhealthy, draw phase denial. So just like Time Seal, it was banned for too long and still isn't at 3 copies, despite being completely unoffensive. Next up we have Tsukiyomi, a level 4 Dark Spellcaster monster. It has all the usual spirit restrictions and has the effect to target and flip down a monster in the field when it's normal summoned or flip face up. Tsukiyomi just had the perfect combination of stats, attribute, and effect to see play during early Yu-Gi-Oh! Formats. It was a dark monster, which gave it chaos synergy. Its 1100 attack may look unimpressive at first, but it was just enough to beat over Monarchs, which it had flipped face down, since they all had 1000 defense. And it returning to the hand would protect Tsukiyomi from being removed by those monsters too. This card's effect can also be used to further your game plan by setting your flip monsters or soft once per turns to flip them face down and reuse them. The other spirit monster from this era that saw play was a Sewer Priest. This is a level 4 light fairy monster with 1700 attack. Besides the spirit effects, it can also attack all monsters your opponent controls once each. A Sewer Priest was good for beating over all scapegoat tokens or removing entire chains of recruiter monsters, as it could attack over them again and again when they kept bringing them out. Its light attribute was even more important for Chaos, since there was actually a shortage of good light monsters, to the point where people sometimes had to play really mediocre ones just to fill space. Tsukiyomi and a Sewer Priest were arguably the peak of the spirit mechanic in Yu-Gi-Oh! For the time, they both had really good effects which weren't present on any other monsters. Their special summon restriction actually served to balance them from being brought back with revival cards. Them returning to the hand gave them a downside, but was also a benefit because it meant you could use them turn after turn until they got answered. At least one of these could be found in most deck lists from back in the day, and while a big part of that is due to old Yu-Gi-Oh! Being so good stuff focused that people would just play the strongest generic cards available, never again did spirits see such widespread play. Then we have Dark Dust Spirit, a level 6 Earth Zombie monster with the effect to blow up all other face-up monsters on the field when it's normal summon. Dark Dust Spirit actually has a pretty great effect, especially for the time it was released in. Its downside lies in the fact that it requires a tribute summon to be brought out, and it returns to your hand during the end phase. And if spirit monsters could already put you behind tempo by using them normally, Dark Dust Spirit set you back even further because of the tribute cost. However, there is a reason why this was the only tribute summon spirit monster to ever see widespread competitive play. The release of Treeborn Frog, which can special summon itself from the graveyard every turn as long as you don't control spells or traps, made Monarch strategies viable for a really long time. However, you had the issue of needing to draw into multiple Monarchs alongside your live Treeborn to actually get value off of it turn after turn. Dark Death Spirit, being the best reusable tribute summon available, helped with this shortcoming massively. Once Frog Monarchs became a more coherent strategy as the Frog engine expanded, this card became a staple in those strategies, only being rivaled by a few other 1-tribute monsters in power. Its relevancy did wane with time, as other boss monsters such as Vanities and Light and Darkness Dragon had its effect, which aged a lot better, but that didn't stop Dark Death Spirit from getting tops to its name even as late as 2014. Despite those being pretty good cards, the mechanic would be left in limbo when it came to support for a really long time. To put it into perspective, these cards were all from 2003. And while Konami did put out some pretty mediocre support for the mechanic at the time, the next large batch of Spirit support wouldn't come out until the Synchro era. In this same set it introduced Stardust Dragon. We also got the first Spirit, which broke up convention and could be special summoned, in Yamato no Kami. There was also generic support for the mechanic with Izanagi, as well as a series of equip cards specifically meant for spirit monsters. While the support wasn't all that bad outside of the equip cards, there still was not enough cohesion between the new support and the old, mostly mediocre cards to make a proper spirit deck work yet. But this batch did give us a monster which would eventually see a little bit of play in Yugioh. This monster has the ability to special summon another level 1 monster from your graveyard when it's normal summoned, but it gets banished when Yugioh leaves the field. It saw play in Chaos Piper strategies as a way to recycle Mystic Piper every turn to draw a card, as Piper could tribute itself to draw a card, and then another if the card drawn was a level 1 monster. It was a pretty ingenious use of the card, but unfortunately those strategies weren't that good at standing up to the competition at the time anyways. Despite being a great rank 1 enabler when XC's monsters were eventually released, it saw no play due to most of them being awfully mediocre back then, and due to there being way better options that were introduced later on in the game, such as the Lureless engine in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Spirits were forgotten and left behind for quite some time then, which led Konami's first attempt to revitalize the mechanic with the new Spirit support, which worked not only pretty nicely as an engine between themselves, but also had synergy with the other existing spirits. These were Aratama and Nikitama, released in back-to-back sets. Aratama is a level 4 Dark Fiend with, of course, all the usual spirit effects. On normal summon, it would get to add any spirit monster from your deck to your hand except itself. Nikitama is a level 4 Light Fairy with the same stats as Aratama, and when it's normal summoned, you get to normal summon another spirit monster in addition to your regular normal summoner set. Also, when it's sent to the graveyard, you draw a card if you control a spirit monster when it's sent there. These two formed a powerful rank 4 engine, which was at its peak at the time. Kage Tokage, a level 4 with special summon itself when you normal summoned, was a must in pretty much all versions of these decks. You could even trigger its effect twice if you drew 2, since you got an additional normal summon. So was Blackluster Soldier and Void at the beginning, because Aratama and Nikitama were dark and light respectively. This powerful advantage engine lets you search spirits every turn with Aratama returning to the hand, while also drawing a card with Nikitama while also spamming rank 4s. Since Aratama lets you search any spirit, it even enabled the use of some spirits which had never seen play before, such as Izanami, which lets you recycle spirits from the graveyard, and Yaksha, which bounce spells and traps. This was the best adaptation spirits could have for the modern time, as getting extra normals would circumvent their downside of not being able to special summon, and by using them as material for XCs, you wouldn't be putting yourself behind on field presence during the end phase. With all that said, though this attempt worked for a while, they were a slower and brickier strategy than most other availables at the time, and only lasted a while as a row contender until the next tide of power crap swept them off the charts again. Now, let's look at a couple of times Konami tried to play this mechanic with varying levels of success. First, we have the Yosenjus, an archetype made of mostly level 4 Beast Warrior monsters, but which also had some pendulum support going for it. Yosenjus borrowed some elements from the spirit monsters, in that all of the Beast Warriors returned themselves to the hand during the end phase of the turn that they're normal summoned. However, the inverse was true for the high level ones, which returned to the end phase during the turn that they were special summoned instead. This lets you play the archetype either as a rank 4 spam strategy, which spams the extra deck while plussing you and disrupting your opponent, or as a pendulum strategy, which could reuse their on-summon effects of their boss monsters. Ultimately, the first playstyle won out competitively, getting a few tops to its name during the highly disputed formats that followed Duelist Alliance. It was essentially just a heavily power-crept version of the previous Aratama Nikitama strategy, a spammy rank 4 strategy which benefits from much better generic support due to the Yosenju's type being an attribute as well as direct support. They had the same theming as spirits, but could have much more cohesive support due to working with only their archetype and not a whole category of monsters. As a consequence, they could be very liberal with the extra normal summons you can get, and since every Kama has them, it made them much better at spamming the field than the sold Nikitama in spirit decks ever could. The other instance of Konami trying to modernize spirits was Shino Birds, which were actually spirits unlike Yosenjus. The regular Shino Bird monsters range from mediocre to terrible, but the ritual part of the archetype had some nice ideas going for it. Shino Baron Peacock can bounce up to 3 monsters your opponent controls to the hand when special summoned, and then lets you special summon a level 4 lower spirit monster from your hand, ignoring its summoning conditions. Shino Baroness Peacock lets you spin 3 back row cards instead, and then special summons a spirit monster from your deck. Both of them also have the effect to bounce themselves during the end phase, but they also give you 2 tokens each when doing so. Peacock and Baron weren't subject to the regular spirit summon restrictions despite being part of the archetype, since they're both rituals, which can only be special summoned by their ritual spell cards. Their on-summon effects are actually really good, as non-destruction, non-targeting removal lets you get around almost every kind of protection a monster can have. Additionally, since they special summon spirits while bypassing their restrictions, this means they won't be bounced back to the hand during the end phase, letting you keep spirits with powerful effects around during your opponent's turn. At last, them giving you advantage when returning to the hand with the tokens they bring out could also have been a nice way to improve spirits, had this kind of effect been thought up sooner. Ultimately, they failed though, as even if they were good in a vacuum, combining the clunkiness of the ritual and spirit mechanics would obviously never amount to a competitive strategy. To make matters worse, they were confined to being an exclusively going second strategy, since the Shino Barons needed to bounce monsters or shuffle spells in order to get the second part of their effects off. All of this while coming out in an era where power creep was at its highest, with the release of Zodiac monsters in the same set they came out in, one of the most powerful archetypes of all time, and the introduction of the link mechanic not soon after. And yet, after another years-long gap of seeing no play, Konami would finally release the next and last Spirit Monsters to be considered a genuinely good card. Outside of a single instance where a Spirit Monster was played as a one-of, as a high-skill tech in some Pendulum decks, this is the last instance of Spirits being in the metagame. And that is, of course, a Mono Iwado, a level 4 Earth Rock monster with 1900 attack. Its effect is that monsters cannot activate their effects except Spirit Monsters. One of the most oppressive effects that a card can have in Yu-Gi-Oh! This kind of floodgate has gotten countless other monsters banned, all present in a normal summonable monster with beefy stats. Amano is the only spirit monster which actually needs all of its restrictions not to be broken. It was a staple in True Draco decks for years when the deck was still relevant. When going first, you don't really activate any monster effects and also can gain extra normal summons with your True Draco back row. So you could use Amano Iwado to prevent your opponent from stopping all of your powerful draw and search spells by making their Ash Blossom and Joy Spring be unable to be activated. Then, when going second, you could use it to disable the entirety of your opponent's board, while the graveyard effects of your True Draco spells and traps pick it apart. The other deck which picked this up was Mystic Mind Burn much later, though not nearly as common as it was in True Draco. Amano was still a very good tech to make sure your mind would stick onto the field even when going second. Amano helps put in perspective why this mechanic has been almost completely forgotten by Konami. Even as far back as 2018, Konami could print a card that says your opponent cannot activate monster effects, something which cannot be power crept by anything short of locking your opponent out of the game entirely, as long as it was coupled with the spirit's usual restrictions. Even with this all-powerful effect, Amano still faced lots of competition in its role by Inspector Border, which offered a weaker lockdown, but with the huge upside of still being there to disrupt your opponent during their turn. While being the strongest part about the mechanic, Amano also makes sure there won't ever be good enough way to easily swarm the field with spirit monsters in the modern metagame. This leaves us where we are now, getting at most one new spirit monster every year. The way this type of monster functions is just an antithesis to modern card design, with the most recently released one being Konohana Sakiwa, which is pretty much just a Mono Iwado support, and the upcoming one being yet another pendulum scale, in hand Shin Kyudo Spirit. There is little reason to believe this mechanic will ever see play in a higher tier strategy ever again. Alright, and that's the video. If you can think of a good way this mechanic could be fixed, or know of any other cards you'd like to see covered, please be sure to leave them in the comments down below.